Last night I'm driving home and I see just, rows and rows of Range Rovers and BMWs and World Cup matches on big screen TVs. And you would think that life is just normal, right? But then, today I was in Beirut and I was visiting some of the bombed out buildings, right? I used to actually live on the same street as a building that got bombed. And you could see just, buildings like pancakes with giant piles of rubble.
This just happened. It's a story from southern Lebanon. A school teacher, her mother, their foreign guest worker, probably, if I know, the Filipino or from Sri Lanka. They work in Lebanon. They were in southern Lebanon, along with a Syrian worker, laborer, probably helping out. They were visiting what was likely the ruins of their house near Nabatea in southern Lebanon when an Israeli drone strike hit their vehicle and kill them all instantly. Imagine that. You're driving in your own country. You're going with your mom and your maid and perhaps a gardener or a laborer to go check up on your family home in the south of Lebanon in your own country, and you're basically struck to death by a drone from another country that is basically occupying yours. And the excuse that the Israelis gave for this was that the military said that the car had approached a security zone and was deemed a threat. So I think that that gives you an idea of what's happening in southern Lebanon right now under a supposed U.S. brokered ceasefire. That is meant to eventually lead to the clearing of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon, where they've been occupying for months, and launching attacks like this one against the civilians as well as the alleged Hezbollah fighters in that area. I am Borzou Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzou.substack.com. That's borzou.substack.com. You can also find me on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, and also on YouTube, where it would be great if you wanted to follow along on YouTube. Hit the like button, hit a review, make a comment. There's also shorts of some of these videos that are scattered around YouTube. In case you see one of them, hit a like or give a comment. That would be wonderful. I'm going to be joined today by Habib Bata, who is the editor of the Beirut Report, a journalistic endeavor in Lebanon, and he has been covering Lebanon for years. He is himself a Lebanese American, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Lebanon as well as some of his journalistic endeavors, including a story that he's been working on for a while about the massive U.S. embassy compound that is being built in Lebanon, the second largest U.S. diplomatic outpost in the world, in Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is a country of 4 or 5 million people, maybe a little bit more than that because of the swelling of the country, because of Syrian refugees, but that might be going down now. I'm curious as to why the U.S. would build the largest diplomatic outpost in its whole archipelago of diplomatic outposts in Lebanon, especially when it has like a huge presence in nearby Iraq as well as a huge presence in neighboring Israel. Why Lebanon? Why would that be such an important place for the U.S. to have the largest diplomatic headquarters in its arsenal of diplomatic missions? And we'll be asking Habib about that. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about just day-to-day life in Lebanon with the peace deal being negotiated. The U.S. is getting the Israeli and the Lebanese leaders to talk and hammer out some kind of peace deal, one that is meeting with a lot of disapproval from factions inside Lebanon, including Hezbollah, but also other groups inside Lebanon. And also some scholars that I've spoken to say that the deal that the Americans are shoving down the Lebanese throats, as the way they put it, is not a good one for Lebanon and will not guarantee them anything. And now joining us is Habib Bata, the editor and founder of Beirut Report, as well as a Lebanon-based journalist and analyst who is joining us from Beirut today.
That's right.
Great. So Habib, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. So I guess one of the questions that people have these days, just in general, is how is life in Lebanon these days? I know that's a complicated question because there's different parts of Lebanon, and life in the south of Lebanon is very different than life in Beirut. And even in Beirut, life is different in South Beirut from the rest of Beirut. And even within the rest of Beirut, life is somewhat different vibe in West Beirut and East Beirut and the various suburbs of Beirut and so on. But I guess just in general, how are living?
It's almost like asking how's life in LA, right? It depends on what part of LA you're in, right? It could be very different in Compton, or than the Beverly Hills and Palisades. So it's kind of like that here, where there's a lot of economic divides, and the economic divides tend to also follow the political violence. So those places that are more economically challenged tend to be the ones that are getting hit the hardest with the bombings. And the Shia community in Lebanon has traditionally been, one of the more marginalized communities in the country. And so the South Lebanon and the Shia villages, right, are getting the brunt of the violence, right? So it has a lot of parallels in a way, right, to the South of the U.S. and Jim Crow and that kind of, you kind of feel like you're living in the Jim Crow era, right, where one part of the country violence is legitimized and constant, and other parts of the country are living in kind of a white supremacy world, right, where everything is provided, where there is nightclubs and restaurants. And so last night I'm driving home. I was in the north of the country. I wanted to go to the beach, and I see just rows and rows of Range Rovers and BMWs and World Cup matches on big screen TVs. And you would think that life is just normal, right? But then, today I was in Beirut and I was visiting some of the bombed out buildings, right? I used to actually live on the same street as a building that got bombed. And you could see just, buildings like pancakes, with giant piles of rubble. Just, that was that very violent day. We call it Black Wednesday.
Yeah.
And that was, I guess a couple of months ago now. And it's still, the rubble is just this giant pile that hasn't been moved. The building looks like it's about to collapse. So you have these buildings that are about to collapse across the city. And what's interesting is to look at these buildings, and when you get up close to them, you can see that these are just, apartments. And you could see that, you could see that if they were trying to hit one person, well, they got 15 floors. And in those floors, you could see a cross section of the building, and you could see basically kitchens, an oven with a door open. You could see somebody's bathroom. It's almost like a dollhouse, right? Like a cross section of life. And it really kind of underscores the brutality and the barbarism of the violence that the city has seen. And again, you have these two kind of versions of Lebanon, right? Where you have part of the country that's living in relative peace, right? But still, even those areas that I visited today were considered to be not Shia areas, right? It's considered more Sunni areas.
What neighborhood was that?
Talat Khayat. Talat Khayat is an area that has a lot of, high rises and, marble cladded, buildings. And beautiful, lobbies and a friend of mine's house. I used to sit in his balcony when I was in my 20s in college, and that building just right next to him just came right down. And so it's very hard to kind of just generalize about Beirut, right? Because it really depends on where you're living. But in general, the entire country, I would say, is in a kind of a state of chaos. And it always has been, and when you notice that whether in a nice neighborhood or a neighborhood getting bombed, is that you can notice really the kind of lack of state, right? The kind of there's no real state control, whether it's the way people drive, the way people park, the way that it's kind of like you can feel like there's no control, and that's why it makes it so kind of ironic, right? That the United States or Israel is expecting the Lebanese government to do what they couldn't do, right?
They can't even bring drinking or bath water. Forget drinking water. They can't even get bath water to people's buildings, much less, people have to truck it in, much less natural gas or electricity, or they can't even do that.
Not even intersection, like one street intersection. The traffic lights don't even work in a street intersection, right? So again, this is a country that has been disintegrated, right, by fragmented by decades and decades and decades of wars, and so it's in no position really, right, to take any massive control of the situation in this country. And especially when being pushed against, right, this genocidal violence that we're seeing day in and day out.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like there's this huge contradiction. On the one hand, the U.S. and Israel are trying to get the Lebanese state to clamp down on Hezbollah, to get control over the government. On the other hand, they seem to be doing everything symbolically, politically, militarily to undermine the authority of the Lebanese state. What do people think of this agreement? I know there's different opinions. It seemed like at first everyone was like, any deal is great. A lot of people were saying that, maybe not the Hezbollah factions, but as the days wore on and the weeks wore on and the op-eds and editorials and, even like some of the LBC crowd are saying, wait, this deal is not such a great it's not such a great thing for Lebanon. And there seems to be more skepticism even among those anti-Hezbollah factions.
Right. I mean, I don't think you have to be a member of Hezbollah or to be a Shiite to kind of recognize that this deal offers almost nothing to Lebanon, right? And Lebanon has zero leverage in this deal, and this puts Lebanon in a much weaker position than it's ever been before, right? So it's basically, this deal it's not even a deal, right? It's just basically imposed Israeli direction, what we want to do in Lebanon, right? And so just kind of just put a rubber stamp on our occupation of the country and say that, we don't have to leave. We're never going to ask the occupiers to leave. And it also is crazy because it removes the legal protections, right? The legal abilities of Lebanese to sue, right? It says that Lebanon will not sue Israel for this genocidal war crimes, right? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine any genocidal force, whether it was apartheid South Africa or the French in Algeria? Imagine saying that, we're just going to let our occupiers we're not even going to raise a civil lawsuit against you, let alone defend our land. And so basically, it is kind of a de facto, right, offering of Lebanon to be colonized, to be taken over by the Israelis. Of course, it's not going to be smooth sailing, and it hasn't been. So it is just kind of ink on a paper on some level, right? Because the Lebanese government has no power to do anything. But it's very hard to defend this deal. I don't really see many people defending this deal. The defense has become very meek. And they've tried to kind of qualify and say, it's a temporary deal, or it's just a framework. They kind of, even the president, right, kind of backing off this language. But it's important to know.
He seemed like such a I'm so sorry, apologize in case there's any fans of Joseph Aoun out there. I don't see that there would be a lot, but he seems just a puppet of the U.S. Embassy. He just seems like he reads the press releases that are emailed to him by the U.S. Embassy.
Right. I mean, again, but it's important to note that this individual, the president, who was, he was an army, he was the head of the army, right? And that's also, it's very also ironic because the army in Lebanon had been very close to Hezbollah for many years and worked with them, in fighting ISIS and in these kind of groups that were trying to invade Lebanon back 10 years ago. And in the Lebanese army, right, it's Israel's considered an enemy, right? Israel has killed many Lebanese army soldiers and even generals, right, in recent weeks and months. And so it's very strange, right? Why would somebody just kind of kneel down like this and really offer nothing, right? He's getting nothing in return, right? Because he has
What's
nothing
his
to
motive?
Well, it's hard to say, but I just wanted to underscore that it's just really the president and the prime minister, just two men, right? Two men basically changing a country's entire, right, a geopolitical stance. It's illegal in Lebanon currently, right, to deal with Israelis. Lebanon's at a state of war with Israel, right, and it's been that way for many years. And so this kind of violates the Lebanese constitution, right? It violates Lebanese laws, and there's no approval, right? There's no approval by the Lebanese parliament. There's no public consensus. There should be a referendum, if anything, right? If you're gonna, imagine the U.S. just deciding that, okay, we're just going to
join the Russian orientation.
Well, they can't even say that's not even so far anymore. But maybe just say join Iran, right? And just say, we're gonna combine our military with Iran or something. I mean, that's the level of what's going on here. Or let's let Iran, right, take Texas. And we'll just, whenever they want, they can leave, right? But also it also kind of sets up Lebanon for a conflict, right? I mean, in order for Lebanon to fulfill what Israel and the United States are asking it to, which is a very irresponsible and genocidal ask, right? Is that you must fight your own people. You must fight Hezbollah, which is, again, probably one of the most powerful, non-state actors in the world today, right? That has undergone 2 years or 3 years now of constant daily barrages and bombings, right, by the most sophisticated militaries in the world with the biggest bombs and the most, intelligence and satellite intelligence, all that stuff, right, and these constant drones flying overhead, and they couldn't do it, right? The most powerful, most deadly, let's say, the most deadly duo in the world, which is the United States and Israel, right, in terms of just raw numbers of deaths and killing of journalists especially, right, and other kind of vulnerable people. if they couldn't do it, right? Now they're saying now you Lebanese government, right? That is so you can't even control a traffic light. You can't even manage the country's basic services, basic needs like electricity and water. You're now going to go after this force, right? With this ragtag army. Let me tell you more about the army. I mean, no disrespect.
And not to mention the fact that there's many examples of, for example, this cousin is a fighter in Hezbollah and this cousin is
Right.
in the army, so basically it's a formula for civil war, essentially. But go on about the army.
Well, we've seen that before, right? We've seen in Lebanon's history, wars have started because the army splits, right? And that happened right after the last agreement with Israel, right? So and the war continued and got much more violent, right? So we have a kind of a model. We have a previous example of what happens when Lebanon signs a peace agreement with Israel under immense U.S. pressure and with no public consensus or back behind that. The country continued to have a civil war and got much worse than it ever had before. So it was a bloodbath, right? But this army of ours, right? No disrespect. I mean, everybody wants to have an army, and it is one of the institutions that Lebanese hope and dream that could be something that could unite the country. And a lot of these are young men, like you said, they're come from all over the country. They're Shia, they're Sunni, they're Christian, right? And they're out there fighting fires, and God bless them for doing that hard work, right? But the way that the military is structured, it actually the military bases itself in Lebanon, often in abandoned buildings, right? That's how low budget the Lebanese military is. They don't even have their own buildings or barracks a lot of the time, right? They're in some old hotels like the Holiday Inn or other places like that where they, I always see them in these kind of bombed out, old buildings. Now they're in this, bus station, this old bus station based in the port of Beirut with this kind of, just ratty curtains that just kind of barely blocking. So they're not even really even well protected, right?
Yeah.
And that's not that's not their fault, right? They just don't have any budget, and that's by design, right? The United States has also designed the Lebanese army in a way that it will never have access to powerful weapons, right? And the United States is the main backer. The United States pays the salaries of the Lebanese army. That's how broke Lebanon is a country. So it's not only a country that's disorganized or chaotic; it's a completely bankrupt country, right? Where the currency has lost 90% of its value. The government, institutions have no budgets to do anything. At one point, they didn't have even paper to print new passports or IDs. You would get a little flimsy piece of paper, and they wouldn't have actually the credit card kind of material to create actual IDs. So everything is kind of bankrupt and missing, and the military is just really kind of an American controlled entity at this point in Lebanon, right? Because it's funded, trained, and even the salaries are paid right by the U.S. And so it's been designed in a way that the Lebanese military is kept very kind of junior and weak, right, compared to Israel. Not even in the same galaxy, right? I mean, I think they have maybe a couple of dozen helicopters. So these are not really they're not Apache
During
helicopters.
Nahr al-Bared, they were the ones who developed the barrel bombs to get rid of the Al Qaeda fighters from the Nahr al-Bared camp, and they used those helicopters to drop bombs on the jihadis holed up in that camp in the north of Lebanon. And it was quite creative, but it was a rather ghetto solution. So to speak.
Right, with their bare hands. It's like a cartoonish, right?
Yeah.
With their bare hands, they were just throwing kind of bombs out the helicopter. There weren't even barrels, right? They were just, and that's interesting to think back about Nahr al-Bared, right? That was about 2007, where the army lost 200 soldiers. It went on for several months, almost half a year, just to fight one militant group, right, in a refugee camp, right? It was just not even 1% probably of what Hezbollah has, right?
With zero public support, by the way. This is a group that had zero public support,
Absolutely.
even in Tripoli. They didn't have any,
Right. And they had attacked. They had attacked and kidnapped Lebanese police. Right. They were a very hated group in the country.
Yeah.
Right. Very small. That's a very great point. Right. Very small amount of people behind them. Hezbollah, right? Half the country almost is behind Hezbollah, right? Whether it's Sunni Christian or Shia, right? The country is very deeply divided at this point and has been, right? Ever since the last 20, 30 years, that's been a very sharp dividing line in Lebanon that hasn't really budged no matter what's happened in the country. Again, there's this great underestimation of the people of the Middle East, right, or Western Asia, however we put it, right? The way that the administration has approached Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, right, as if they would just crumble, if they would just, if we kill their leaders, right, they'll just be finished. And we see by the funeral, right, just yesterday, right, the millions that came out, right. So this kind of complete, it's a kind of Orientalism, a kind of racism that says, oh, these people are weak, they're nothing, nobody likes them. There's just an ignorance, right, about these cultures, right, and the fact that I don't know any organization on earth, right, that could sustain what Hezbollah has sustained, right, to have all of its major leaders and generals being killed, right, to be under constant bombing and all of its centers and underground bunkers, right, being bombed, and to still be fighting back and launching, and now a whole new page of technology that Hezbollah has developed. These almost like dental floss, right? These little tiny miles of dental floss, right? That are connecting these drones, these fiber optic cables that are able that the Israelis cannot stop, right? And so in many ways, right, it's such a ridiculous notion, right, that the Lebanese military would ever fight Hezbollah or even try to. And the Lebanese military is not that foolhardy, right? I mean, the head of the military, Rudolf Heikel, right? The commanding general, he's been the ire of like people like Lindsey Graham are so angry that he's not willing, right? He's not willing to fight Hezbollah. And any rational, logical person knows that the way that Lebanon functions is by consensus, right? You cannot function Lebanon by attacking one community or another, because all the communities in Lebanon have a lot of power. Especially, right, those in the south, right, who are battle hardened, right, battle worn, and know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's another point too. I mean, here's an army that, like, in terms of Hezbollah, they've been fighting the greatest army of the Middle East for decades. And they have like a real battle experience. I remember once in 2008 when the real Hezbollah appeared on the streets of Beirut. Those motherfuckers looked scary. I mean, they looked like, special forces, U.S. special forces, very big, very large men with like heavy equipment, lots of battle rattle and so on. So, I mean, right. And then you see the Lebanese army soldiers at the checkpoints. I mean, they're lovely. They'll ask a girl for her phone number. I mean, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm talking about?
You'll crack jokes with them, and it's. And they're just young. They're just young kids oftentimes, right? They're barely shaving. They barely know how to hold a gun. They barely have any, training or experience. Again, no shade. And we, but this is the reality we must confront. We cannot hide from that reality any longer. And the machinery they're operating, right? So there's no air power, number one, right? To speak of. Again, Hezbollah has been fighting the most advanced air power in the world, right? And still surviving. There's no, real tanks or,
armor.
The armor that they have. It reminds me of, we're old enough to remember the show MASH, right? I mean, it's Vietnam era. It's literally, it feels like Apocalypse Now or some movie from the 60s, right? I mean, that's the old clunky armor, right? That they're running. They got a bunch of Hummers, right? But those aren't really, going to do much in the battlefield, right? And again, like they don't really have the kind of, you're fighting a guerrilla force, right? You're out there in the open, right? But again, it would never come to that point. I think, Lebanon has learned, one thing we've learned in Lebanon, right, is like that we can't have another civil war, right? Because we went through a civil war for 20, 30 years in this country, going back from, not just the 75, to 90 war, but also going back to the 50s, the late 50s and throughout the 60s. There's always been this, and it's just really destroyed and wrecked the country to its core, right? So no one wants to go back to that. No one's foolish enough. I think the Lebanese government, which is just represented by two men, right? Nawaf Salam, the prime minister, and Michel Aoun, the current Joseph Aoun, sorry, different Aoun, right? It's a lot of Aouns. They're just really kind of, I feel like they're just kind of like playing along. They're kind of just role playing and saying, oh, we'll sign this, we'll sign that, we'll do whatever we want. They have some idea. I think they have this idea in their head, and a lot of Lebanese have this idea. And again, the country is split, right? There is a big part of the country that's very anti-Hezbollah, very pro-America. And let's not forget, there's a deep colonial history there, right? And there's an economic divide. There's an economic privilege often. Those who are economically privileged, right, prefer to be, in the capitalist Western society and making deals, and, they're often business owners and that kind of thing. It's just such a big gap, right, in the country. But they kind of have these kind of American white supremacist beliefs, right? Colonial beliefs that say that America is invincible. America is the guarantor of the whole world. America is the policeman of the world. They kind of put America on this pedestal, right? Which, again, we're seeing, right, what happened with Iran, right? We're seeing how America, all in all its might and power, right, couldn't actually take on, right, this regime that they thought was going to be so easy to hit, right? This kind of middle country military. So, I think that there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of kind of
Wishful thinking.
imagination, right, and fantasizing about America as coming in Lebanon, just fixing the whole country, right? And again, that comes from this deep-rooted kind of colonialism that we have in our schools, right? Let's not forget that most of our schools are French or English language, the good schools in Lebanon, whether they're universities, whether they're high schools, and kids are really in those affluent sectors are not really learning the history. They're not really learning about what the U.S. did to Lebanon, right? And you have so many propagandists in this country, right? We have some people have like this one guy's like a history page, and he did and he's well loved in the country for kind of showing off historical documents and maps and stuff, but he actually just did a partner with the U.S. Embassy, right, to create propaganda about America having a great role in Lebanon, and the U.S. Embassy is so active, right, in all these spaces that they're really kind of pushing a discourse. They're pushing a kind of a brainwashing, right, toward the public to I don't like the term brainwashing, but it is kind of just a conditioning, right? Let's say that America is here to help. America wants to save you. And I just posted, I don't know if you saw, just on July 4th, a couple of days ago, right? There was this ad campaign throughout the entire city that had this, waving American flag, right? Fluttering American flag saying Happy 4th of July. It was insane. It was like on maybe 50 billboards. It was almost like a kind of just a not so subtle brainwashing, right? That this is our master now, America. And it was some Lebanese businessman who apparently is really well tied to the Americans. And we don't know what kind of deals are being made between the embassy and these kind of people, but they're really pushing this pro-American narrative, kind of pushing it down people's throats in the country right now.
Habib, I wanted to ask you about something. You mentioned this immunity clause in this peace deal for the Lebanese and for the Israeli forces in Lebanon, and you also mentioned this almost fetishization of the U.S. role and this trust they're putting in, even despite the suspicion of Israel on the part of many Lebanese. There was this, and I mentioned it in the intro to this show. I mentioned this incident I think it was yesterday, the day before, where a Lebanese school teacher and her mom and their, I guess, Filipina or Sri Lankan nanny and a Syrian laborer were visiting the house near Nabatea. And then like a drone strike, just an Israeli drone strike, just casually incinerated all of them. And killed all of them. And the Israeli response was like the car was moving in a threatening manner. But so you hit it with the drone. I mean, it was insane. Don't those Lebanese that fantasize about the American role and worship the U.S., don't they see that and don't they react to that at all? That could have been their mom and their sister going on a visit to the house. Or do they so dehumanize the people of that part of the country that they don't count those people as real Lebanese?
I mean, it's so dehumanizing, right? I mean, we just have to listen to the statements of the Israeli leaders, right? If you could I wanted to pull up some just to read to you what the things that they've said about Lebanon. It's insane. The kind of statements that have been made lately. I'll have to, we'll burn Lebanon to the ground. We'll send Lebanon to the Stone Age.
So don't the Maronites and the elite Sunni react to that?
And we've seen them going into Christian houses, going into churches, spray painting on all the walls, taking an axe to Jesus on a crucifix statue. And then Netanyahu has the gall to say, right, that Lebanese Christians are begging to be part of Israel. Certainly not in the South, right, where they have been desecrating Christian, symbols, desecrating churches. They've even sent a warning out at one point saying that you're not allowed to hide Muslims in your house, right? Almost as like Anne Frank kind of moment, right? So Israel has been destroying, right, Christian villages and Christian places of worship in Lebanon. But yeah, I think people do develop this kind of compartmentalization. That's the kind of power of, right, these ideological forces, right? I mean, just like Americans. Don't Americans see what their government is doing, right? Americans don't see that the killing, the famine, right, the genocide. I mean, it's just now, right? It's taken so many years of us screaming about this, right? And this is not new, right? I mean, I experienced a lot of these things in 2006, in 1996, right? My whole life, right, has been Israeli planes bombing Lebanon, but maybe this is the biggest version of it, but it has been the same trend. And you ask yourself, well, why? How can people do that? It's amazing what money can do, what the
how can any Lebanese trust this, given that?
Right. Again, it's the same question you could ask to Americans, to all people, right? People get to the point where they become numb to violence, and it's a dehumanization, right? That's the first step, right? How did slavery happen, right? How did colonization happen? How did all these other genocides happen, right? It was because people had just dehumanized the other to a point, right? Where they associate America with money, with Hollywood movies, right? With success, with being part of the world, with fixing their country, right?
Is the Lebanese in Ashrafia, do they associate the Lebanese in Nabatea with just not human?
Right. I mean, there's a deep Islamophobia. Lebanon is built on Islamophobia, right? Again, imagine, right? Lebanon was designed by the French, right? The French in the 1920s were really racist folks, right? Yeah. They were doing genocides, they were mass murdering, right? All this was happening back then, right? All these borders were drawn by colonial powers that kind of instilled that, right? So the French are, as I said, they're heavily invested in the school system, right? So imagine if you're a Lebanese student, right? And you grew up, you're not in South Lebanon, right? So because they have done this sectarian war where they've only mainly attacked the Shiites, right? You think, oh, they're not attacking me because I didn't hurt them, right? So you develop this kind of simplistic logic, especially when you're living in such a collapsing situation, right? People are so desperate to survive here. They're so desperate to immigrate, right? Lebanese are always, leaving. My father left when he was a kid. And I had to leave Lebanon at one point, right? Because there's just no opportunity in the country, right? And so you're so desperate. You're kind of brought down to your knees, right? And you're kind of fed this idea of, that Shiites are terrorists and Muslims are terrorists, right? For and again, they don't dress like us, right? They like the Lebanese Christians think that they want to be like European. They've been, again, this is not something that happened overnight, right? This thing has happened over decades and decades and decades. Lebanese Christians were promised, right, the promised land by the French, that they were enlightened, that they were the Phoenicians. They're not even Arabs, right? So much work has been done, right, to create this mentality, and then of course it's capitalism too, right? So we live in a very highly capitalized society in Lebanon, right? Where it's almost like a neoliberal dream, right? It's like a Republican. It's a Republican. I would love to bring Republicans on a field trip to Lebanon to show them like what it's like when there's no taxes, no regulations, and corporations can do whatever they want, right? And just screw the poor. Let them just figure it out by themselves, and you get Lebanon, right?
It's a libertarian fantasy, really.
And I think that's kind of at the root of it, right? Is that people are just kind of, the private sector is supreme in Lebanon, right? And they're kind of prideful about that, right? Which is kind of weird, right? So at night when you're driving, for example, right, the highways are totally pitch black, right? There's no electricity to power the street lights, right? Or rarely the fuel will be on. But then the lights of the advertisements and the billboards, right, and the million gas stations and the million nightclubs and the million restaurants, right, are just like blinding you, right? So, but it's kind of like jarring because you can't really see the road because you're getting the lights from this side, and that's like a really bad sign in a society, right? That we have been basically told that our institutions are worthless, right? Our culture is worthless. We need to be Western. We need to be part of the world economy. So there's this kind of business attitude in Lebanon, right? That says we just want to make money. Everybody's just got to make money. And there's not really an idea of how do we come together, work together as a society to pool our efforts together, right? To make it in this world. And that's not a thing that Americans or Westerners have over Lebanese, right? They've been forced into that, right? Western society, you're kind of forced into the system. You don't have a choice if you want to pay taxes. You don't have a choice if you want to follow the police, right? There is a monopoly on violence, right? And a huge amount of violence took place in order to get to that stage, right? But Lebanon is more of an embryonic state, right? Where we never had that kind of, one group dominating and telling everybody what to do. So naturally people just, will just adapt to their environment, right? So that's the environment that we have, an environment of hyper-capitalism, right? How do you survive, right? Making money, opening, a store, selling products from abroad, right? It's an anti-productive culture, right? It's consumer culture, And so again, this is the kind of byproduct of colonialism, right? It kind of creates this world in which you have countries that produce the goods, right, and then countries that consume it and provide the raw materials. And that's the kind of economic structure that marginalizes places, not just like Lebanon, but other places as well. The difference with Lebanon is that we have all those problems Global South has, plus we have Israel, right? Plus we have this genocidal force that is just being gassed up constantly, right, by the European Union, by the Americans, all right, by the Canadians. Everybody's right. Everybody's jumped on board. The Gulf countries, right, are all like pushing this, dominance and this racist apartheid state on us. So it makes Lebanon's Global South problems even more complicated, right? The gap is much important.
You talked quite a bit about the oversized role of the U.S. in Lebanon. You also have written about the literally oversized diplomatic outpost that the U.S. is building or is near completed building in Beirut, just north of Beirut, and the embassy compound around the time when I was there, like maybe 10 years ago, et cetera, that was already pretty big. And now they've revamped it and they're rebuilding it to make it even bigger and more fortified. Why? I mean, Lebanon is what, 4 or 5, 6 million people with the refugees in it now. It's not a particularly economically important country. The U.S. has huge diplomatic outposts in nearby Athens, in Israel, in Baghdad, etc. What's the point of making this massive compound in Lebanon? Why do you suppose?
Right. Well, just to tell you how massive it is, right? It's not a building, right? It's kind of like a medieval city, right? Where you had those medieval, a giant wall around it, right? And with the castles and the kings and everybody, but not just like the castle, right? But a whole like city. It's 19 buildings, right? And behind these giant walls, it is basically a mountaintop. Right. And it's so big that it's bigger than any building in Lebanon. Right. The presidential palace, the Ministry of Defense, nothing compares to it. Right. So just imagine that for a minute. It's bigger than the White House and Congress combined. Right. It's 43 acres. So imagine in America, for example, the equivalent. Right. Imagine like the Russians building an embassy bigger than the Pentagon. Right. I mean, it makes no sense. Right. So when a country has an embassy that's bigger than your entire government, right? Is it really an embassy or is it a shadow government? So that's the kind of thing people are kind of saying, is that this is basically where the United States will basically run, right? Lebanon will run the region, right? It's got, in Syria, its role is not, maybe it's a little bit more shaky, right? So in Lebanon, again, because we have this community in Lebanon, right? They have this largely Christian community, right, that has been so kind of indoctrinated, right, and is so welcoming, right, to the West, and so kind of deeply, Islamophobic, right, in many ways, right, not totally, though there is a lot of sectarian. I do want to say that Lebanon does have a spirit of sectarian cooperation, right. For every sectarian conflict in Lebanon, there's hospitals and there's institutions where Muslims, Christians work hand in hand all the time, right? But there is a kind of extremist community in Lebanon, right? That rejects Islam, and it allows so much leeway to the United States, right? It's almost like the way that Israel provides that for the U.S., right? And so I think they're so free to operate here. I think that's part of the reason why they went so big, right? They feel so comfortable. They can really just kind of do whatever they want, right? There's so little regulation on them in the neighborhood that they're living in. They're living in a neighborhood, right, that is solidly, right, has a history of Christian kind of militancy. There's a major...
What's that town where they're in building it in?
Right. Well, it's an Auka, right, which is not really a politicized town, but it does have, right, the headquarters of the Lebanese forces in that same, right, not just a few clicks from the embassy, right, is this big compound for the Lebanese forces, which is, was a former militia, right, that was, right, quite fascist, right, quite allied with Israel, quite, led massacres in refugee camps, that kind of thing, right? They would argue there was massacres in Christian areas as well, right? But again, that's the kind of habitus, right, of this embassy that it's inhabiting. I think they have a lot of freedom there. Now, they have access to, there's two bases in Lebanon, 2 airstrips that are run by the Americans, right? They've been very developed over the years. There's kind of a kind of speculation that the Iranians tried to hit one of those bases. That's when the missile kind of fell down in a Christian part of Lebanon. So they have access to these kind of 2 military bases that they've got runways there. They're kind of flying in weapons all the time for, the Lebanese military, right? So, and this kind of base, I call it a base, right? Because it's not really an embassy. It's such a fortified, I've never seen so much concrete in my life, right? And also, let me just add the fact that this has been under construction for almost 10 years now, right? So there are billion-dollar embassies that are being built in other places, like in Mexico, like in Turkey, like in, where else is there?
Mexico.
India Turkey, as well, right?
Massive countries that...
Yeah, they're massive countries, but also... Yeah. Right, but also those embassies got done within 4 or 5 years. Right. This has been 10 years in the making, and I live not far from it, so I've kind of watched it being built over this last decade. They spent about 5 years underground, right, before the thing surfaced. right? So I mean, God knows like what's in there, right?
Have you asked the Americans what the vision is here?
Oh, I mean, they would give you some basic answer like, we're supporting, this is the way embassies are built nowadays, and we need to be fortified. Obviously, the Americans were attacked in Beirut, right? Worse than ever before, right? The embassy
Well,
was
that's why
attacked.
they built the previous. That's why they have the current or previous embassy as some. It was already kind of a fortress. When I used to visit in
Right.
Elkhart, it was not exactly like out there in the middle of the neighborhood where you could get there and there was checkpoints to get to the checkpoints and so on.
Massive electrified fences, a razor wire as big as, two, three cars stacked up. But that's a chicken coop compared to what they're building now, right? And so the initial budget was $1 billion. It seems to have gone well over that.
Yeah.
Some say it could go up to 2 billion. It's all speculation because they don't tell us anything. But the amount of land, the amount of buildings, the helipads that will be there. Some people speculate that there could be some kind of, there's a massive marine barracks on this facility. It could be a place that they could be a staging ground, right? It could be an intelligence gathering
For what? If they want to
unit.
take over Lebanon, there's nothing. There's not going to be any effort.
Well, it's also, it's not far from Syria, right? It's not far from other places. Again, sometimes, you need that stopover, right? When you're going to other parts of the
Yes.
region, Iran, et cetera. It could be a medical facility. It could be a giant medical facility, right? For all we know. But some people have speculated that it could be a black site, a rendition site, a site where there could be, people can
Do
be
we
brought
still
for
do that? I don't even
imprisonment. Well, I don't know why we've done so many other things, right? I mean, we're supporting genocide now, so I think everything's on the table, So there's a lot of speculation about it because there's just very little communication. But they've gone all out. I mean, there's enough concrete. They had their own concrete quarry on site. That's how much concrete they used for this place. The walls are just massive. I mean, I think this thing will be around. The Lebanese, Lebanon's famous for ruins, right? The ruins of ancient civilizations going back to Baalbek, right?
Yeah.
3,000 years old, right? Civilizations, Roman have lasted, right? I think this embassy will last at least, a few thousand years the way it's being built. It could last longer than Baalbek. So, and they're trying to bring in this old American rule. The American rule of the 50s and 60s in Lebanon was very much controlling the country, right? And wow, surprise, surprise, look how that turned out, right? So at one point you had like Americans where basically the embassy was controlling the government. They were actually vetting, right, cabinet positions back in the 60s. Right, and this is well documented in my piece in Merip. You read it's called Beirut and the Birth of the Fortress Embassy. There are records that detail this American control almost over the Lebanese political scene at that time, even discouraging, labor unions, right, trying to control the economic country, building big pieces of infrastructure. There was, American insurance companies had big, headquarters in Beirut. The U.S. Navy would come for Fleet Week, right? And
One time, it was sort of the Dubai of the region in a way. Many of the corporate headquarters were here
Right.
before the Civil
Right.
War.
Pan Am was the world's biggest airline. They had a huge operation out of Beirut, right? So America was really controlling Lebanon in some sense, right? To some extent, right? During those years. And it seems like they're trying to revive that, right? In a much more hardened, fortified version. There was no Hezbollah back then, right? So
Yeah.
now they're kind of going bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's such the building dwarfs everything around it. Right. So it's kind of a statement itself in the architecture of dominance that it really kind of sets out.
Habib, final question. I wanted to ask you about the other overbearing country that plays an undue influence on Lebanon, Iran. There was a lot of people reasonably saying that you are dragging us into your problems with Israel and the United States. I could understand that point of view. It was because of the Hezbollah participation in the February 28th war against Iran by Israel and the United States that this whole crisis was triggered, even though, of course, Israel was hitting Hezbollah and other Lebanese positions all throughout the so-called ceasefire that began following the 2004 round of fighting, 2024 round of fighting. What is the opinion now of this overbearing role of the Iranians and bringing up Lebanon in the peace talks with the United States? And some people say that the Lebanese should be appreciative of Iran trying to use its leverage to bring about some kind of favorable deal for the Lebanese. Some people say, no, we want Iran to butt out. What do you think? What is your assessment?
Well, again, it's a very divided country, right? So you'll find a point of view in Lebanon that will be very similar to Fox News' point of view, right? That, it's Islamophobic, Iran is terrible, they're killing us, they're terrorists, right? All that stuff, right? But I mean, if you look at the facts and figures, right? Iran is not committing a genocide in Lebanon, right? Or among Lebanon's neighbors. Iran has not made genocidal statements like we will burn all of Lebanon, right? Which has been, so many Israelis, politicians have said that. And Iran is actually the one country on the planet, right, who has actually said that we will not allow this conflict to continue in Lebanon. They've put their foot down. They've actually left meetings, right? And the Americans are very shocked by this. They don't understand that, right? They don't understand that deep relationship that Iran has to Hezbollah, right? And so it's actually interesting that it's
to note. It's also to the
right. Well, it's also very modern, though, right? I mean, that's one aspect of it, right? But it's a modern relationship, right? It's a give and take, right? They both kind of, I don't think that one really controls the other. They're allies, kind of like the U.S. and Israel, right? I mean, it's kind of like that in some ways, right? But less genocidal, right? Because Lebanon and Iran have not committed a genocide. It's a very important point to bring to the fore. They have not erased Lebanese villages from the map, right? I mean, Israel has taken over like 60 Lebanese villages, right? They've completely erased, something like a dozen villages, right? They've burned everything, from the grass to the animals to the people, right? They've double tapped on journalists.
One could argue that it's because of Iran's role that they did this. It's because of southern Lebanon's connection to Iran that this happened, and that if southern Lebanon was a normal place, this would not have happened.
Right. Well, it's worth pointing out that southern Lebanon is not a normal place because it's under Israeli occupation, right? Israel's been invading and attacking Lebanon since 1948. People don't realize that in 48, Israel actually first took Lebanese villages. Then in the 60s, and then in the 80s, right? And then I mean in the 70s as well, right? And then the 90s, right? And then again in the last few years, right? So again, Iran has not been putting its troops over and taking over the country, right? Hezbollah has grown as a reaction, right, to Israel, right? Hezbollah is a lot younger, right, than Israel is, right? About half the age of Israel, right? So I think it's worth noting that those kind of arguments, right, really don't kind of have a logical basis to them.
Are there people who are not just pro-Hezbollah shills who appreciate the Iranian use of its leverage?
Well, I mean, again, I think you don't have to be a Shia or a member of Hezbollah, right, to really kind of see what a lot of people are seeing across the world, right? So many podcasters, so many people in the US,
are there voices?
So many Jews, right, Jews for peace, right, have been saying that, right? So, of course, you have Lebanese Christians, you have Lebanese Muslims, you have Sunnis, right, okay, who are kind of conscious about geopolitics, right? And that's just a segment of society, unfortunately, that just like it is in the West, right? It's starting to change. Right, there is a segment of society that say, hey, you know what? This is enough with Israel, right? But because in Lebanon, again, the war and the fighting has been so intense, people have been so brought to their knees, right, by the economic collapse, right, by the wars, the fighting, right? They're just so desperate, there's such a desperation, right, that they don't really have time to, intellectualize and to philosophize, right? So people will have that. But again, when you see arguments that are anti-Iranian, right, and anti-Hezbollah, right, you will trace to those arguments a lot of Islamophobia, right, that's been built into that, right? It's often, it's just like in the U.S., right, when you have those racist arguments being made by, Trump supporters, right? It's not just something that just, stands on its own. There's an ideological basis, a deep ideological basis to that. And so, there is this feeling that, we want to join the Western world. We want to be capitalist, this kind of fantasy about America coming in and fixing the whole country, right? I mean, again, there's so many, let me just tell you, there's so many USAID projects. There's so many Italian, European Union projects, French projects in Lebanon. I mean, if you go to parts of Lebanon, you'll see so many NGOs and so many projects. And you would think that the whole country would be fixed by now, right? All these projects. And guess what? Almost none of them have done anything, right? These are all very piecemeal projects, a couple of streetlights here and there, a pipe here, a road here. That doesn't really address the country. The country needs, right? It needs to be able to have a kind of a manufacturing sector, right? To stand up on its own 2 feet, right? To have a kind of have a territorial integrity, right? Have a stability, have an infrastructure, right? The country has no infrastructure, right? So it's kind of like a shortcut, right? Just to say, well, those are bad guys. Let's get them out of here, right? And that'll fix the country, right? But we know that doesn't work, right? It hasn't worked anywhere. It hasn't worked in Libya. It hasn't worked, in Syria. It hasn't worked in Iraq. All these places, right? We've thought that, if we just remove the top, or remove one party, it'll fix those countries. It's a great ignorance, right, about how the global economy works. right? And so no matter what your government is, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Buddhist, whether it's communist, right? If you're being isolated and sanctioned by the United States of America, right? And if you're being attacked or bombed by the United States and its allies, right? Nothing, no ideology is going to save you from that, right? Whether it's Cuba, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Iran, all different religions, all different ideologies, and you still have these countries being brought to their knees. And I think most people don't have really the kind of wherewithal or the training, right, to actually go into that because they're just so busy trying to survive day to day, right? And they see destruction, they see war, right? Nobody wants war, nobody wants destruction, right? But if you don't live in the South, a lot of Lebanese never go to the South, right? Just like a lot of Americans never go to Compton, right? A lot of Republicans will never go to, Black neighborhoods or understand what's happening in the global South, right? They don't go there, they don't live there. It's when you don't know somebody personally, right? You can fear them. You can kind of, when they're a different religion than you, right? There's so much Islamophobia again in the discourse and the ether, right? Constantly being pushed at us through films, through so many things. And you have some really right-wing TV channels in Lebanon, right? Just like you have the situation, just like you have Iran International, right? Yeah. You have, other ones in other places, right? You have the same thing here. You have these kind of channels that are very Fox News-like, right? They're very kind of sensationalist, anti-xenophobic, anti-Muslim, right? A lot of Christian supremacy, right? Talk, right? That Christians will save the country, that Christians are the civilized people. So, going back to M.A. Cesar, it's Edward Said, it's all that ideology that's so deeply embedded, right? That settler ideology that says that, we must respect our colonizers. They will help us, right? And again, if you look at history, if you look at the numbers, right? The colonized countries of the world are not doing very well, right? Typically, right? The colonizers are still on top. So people have a lot of trouble, I think, breaking through that, again, because there's so much lure of money, jobs, right? If you're a Lebanese and you graduate from college, right, where are you going to work, right? You want to work at an American university. You want to work at an American institution. You want to work at a European institution. You want to work at an NGO. You want to travel abroad. You want to get a visa, right? So people are just thinking about their own survival, and that's what they do to people, right? They kind of break people down to the point where you can't really survive and make money in this world, right, unless you are tied to that capitalist, right, American society, whether it's in Lebanon, right, or elsewhere. So they make it really difficult, I think, economically. And that economic war has really kind of made people so polarized, I think.
Habib, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. Hopefully we'll talk soon as the crisis, or hopefully some kind of peace in Lebanon unfolds. I really appreciate it.
So great to be with you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for listening or watching. This is Badlands, a podcast by me, Borzu Daragahi. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. I'm also available on YouTube, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts.